We have met the enemy, and he is us.
All personnel report to the nearest tornado shelter.
The topic tonight, I think, is rather intriguing. We've met the enemy and he's us. How do we overcome our own misconceptions and how to promote amateur radio in the 21st century? I'll mute myself, Rich, and let me turn it over to you. Rich Moseson, W2VU.
Good evening, everybody, and happy holidays in advance. And it's great to be with you all tonight and to see some familiar faces, people I haven't seen in a long time, and some new faces as well. I do have a prepared script here, but feel free at any time to jump in and ask a question, make a comment, etc. We have met the enemy and he is us. This is a line from Pogo, the cartoon possum, if any of you remember him from the 60s and 70s. And Walt Kelly, the cartoonist, coined this phrase in 1970, which was, it was for the first Earth Day. Speaking of my environmental connections, it ties in there. But it also ties in so much to ham radio and how we constantly shoot ourselves in the foot. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. How many times have any of us seen or heard a quote like, oh, ham radio may be low tech and old fashioned, but it still gets through when nothing else will? How many times have you heard ham radio described, or described it yourself perhaps, as a graying hobby that's having trouble attracting young people? If you look around at the screens here, we don't have a whole lot of young people on the meeting, but that's another issue. So let's talk about this a little bit. How do we overcome our misconceptions? And first of all, why are these misconceptions? And how do we go about correcting them and reaching out in a way that promotes ham radio as the high-tech hobby that it really is? So let me take you back to 1970, the year that ham radio was at its absolute peak. The reason for that is because that's the year I got my license. And I bet for just about all of you, ham radio was at its absolute peak the day your license arrived in the mail. And then it's been downhill ever since. There are reasons for that. When you first get your license, ham radio has endless potential. And it can be anything, and you can do anything with ham radio, and there's no limit to the possibilities. And then reality sets in, you start getting involved with this and that, you get involved with a club that may not be the friendliest in the world, or doing the most interesting things, and you may get somebody yelling at you on a repeater or something like that, and the nature of the hobby kind of goes down in your estimation. But the truth is that the possibilities are endless, and that is part of the message that we need to get out to people, is the endless possibilities that are available to us in the world of ham radio. But when a news report portrays ham radio as being old-fashioned or low-tech or a dying hobby, where did that reporter get that impression? From personal experience? Probably not. Most likely, he or she got that impression from one of us. One or more hams being interviewed for the article, or maybe even a club president, or hopefully not, but a public information officer. I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, those descriptions may not be complimentary to the hobby, but they're accurate. We're not going to lie. Well, I've got news for you. They're not. And you're wrong. So let's take a look at some of the popular myths about ham radio, and then at some facts. Number one myth: ham radio is slowly dying. I got to tell you, ham radio has been successfully dying for the last 75 years. Ever since it was brought back from the dead after World War II. In 1970, the year I got my novice license, does anybody know how many hams there were in the United States then? I can't see everybody at once. So Gordon, You
I'm
put your
going to
hand up.
wing it and say around 175,000 to 180,000.
You're under a little bit. It was 285,000.
It's 285.
Anybody know how many hams there are today?
750,000.
That's right, 780,000. So we're dying, all right. Yep. It's an increase of nearly 500,000 licenses in 50 years. There are close to 25,000 more hams today than there were just 3 years ago. So much for dying. Number 2, ham radio is old-fashioned and low-tech. While I love group in ham radio who loves their boat anchors and restoring vintage gear, and those make very pretty pictures on TV and in the background of newspaper and magazine articles, they really don't and shouldn't reflect what ham radio is and define ham radio. This should define us. Amateur radio is a spacefaring hobby. Most likely, the only spacefaring hobby. I can't think of another. We build and operate our own satellites. We bounce signals off the moon, off the aurora, off meteor trails. We launch radio-equipped balloons into the near space and send them floating around the world, sometimes more than once. Some of us have personal space weather stations that we use to monitor conditions in the ionosphere and beyond. What other hobby has people with personal space weather stations? Even the signals that we bounce off the upper layers of the ionosphere on HF are traveling into space and back. And that's why it's important for us to understand space weather, because it affects us and what we do. We at CQ have a very personal connection to this aspect of our hobby. This month, by the way, marks a very important milestone in the history of amateur radio space communications. It was 60 years ago this month, in December of 1961, that the first amateur radio satellite, Oscar 1, was launched into orbit. And it wasn't only the first amateur radio satellite, but the first privately built satellite ever launched, period. Everything up until then had been built and launched by governments. And the birth of the amateur radio space program can be traced to the pages of CQ. In April 1959, then semiconductors editor Don Stoner, W6TNS, who is unfortunately now a silent key, wrote about plans for a balloon carried, see, we were sending balloons up even then, solar-powered transistor repeater. And he mused in print, can anyone come up with a spare rocket for orbiting purposes? Well, it turned out somebody could. That throwaway line set in motion Project Oscar, which, if you're not aware, stands for Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio. And Don and two other CQ columnists, George Jacobs, W3ASK, and Bill Orr, W6SAI, also a silent key, became heavily involved in Project Oscar. And since 1961, more than 100 satellites designed and built by hams have been launched into orbit, providing long-range communications without worrying about the vagaries of propagation. Oscar 100, appropriately named, is the first geosynchronous amateur radio satellite. It appears to remain in one spot overhead in the sky, just like those high-tech TV satellites, even though we're low-tech. Its footprint covers all of Africa and Europe, most of Asia, some of South America. We have an article in the December issue of CQ about a public SDR station in Brazil that you can tune in over the internet and listen in on Oscar 100. So you can hear what is going on ham radio's first and so far only geosynchronous satellite. Oscar 94, anybody know where to find Oscar 94? It's in orbit around the moon. So yeah, we're old-fashioned and low-tech. Nearly 40 years ago, in 1983, astronaut Owen Gary at W5LFL took a 2-meter handheld with him into space aboard the shuttle Columbia and made the first ham radio contacts from Earth orbit. Today, amateur radio is a staple aboard the International Space Station. Many astronauts, if not most, hold ham licenses. And ARIS, the amateur radio on the International Space Station program, which celebrated its 20th anniversary this year, has introduced thousands of young people to amateur radio and to careers in science, technology, engineering, and math, which curiously becomes STEM, not to mention space travel. Actually, amateur radio space communications extends even further back, before 1961. The first two-way amateur radio moon bounce contact was made in 1960, and pioneering hams had been hearing their echoes off the moon since 1953. Hams started conducting experiments with meteor scatter communication in the 1940s, became popular among the military before it caught on among hams after those experiments. The digital modes used for most meteor scatter contacts today, not to mention FT8, have their roots in software developed by K1JT for cutting-edge radio astronomy. Photogenic nature of tube gear suggests that hams are technologically stuck in the past. But the truth is that our products are on a par with the high-tech stuff that makers are building today. Microcontrollers like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis are everywhere in ham radio today. At least half of the project articles in CQ have an Arduino or similar microcontroller at the heart of what they do. Glenn Popeil and Jack Purdom keep pumping out project books on microcontroller projects. Jack just took over our long-running microcontrollers column in CQ. Looking forward to seeing what he has to offer in the coming months. So even those ham projects that are not destined for space are still quite high-tech. And knowing code today applies equally to Morse code and computer code. So some of us know one, some of us know the other, and some of us know both. Ham radio really is a technological sandbox. It provides a unique forum to experiment that is otherwise found only in industrial or university labs. And not always there either, since so much commercial R&D today focuses on digital communications. There's a problem with that. The world is wireless, and all those digital signals have to travel over analog RF pathways. And amateur radio provides an unparalleled opportunity to try new things and build a better virtual mousetrap. Yet another myth is that ham radio is no longer appealing to young people. You know, I was involved with the formation of Newsline's Young Ham of the Year Award, and I'm still privileged to be a judge on that. That award was created to address this very problem. More than 30 years ago, the hams who are complaining today that young people are supposedly no longer interested in the hobby are the same people who 30 years ago were supposedly not there and not coming into the hobby. So the kids are there. They're doing great things. Our next generation of leaders is already beginning to emerge. They're just do things differently. Clubs and groups in person are not big things for young people today. They live their social lives online, and we need to reach out to them where they are instead of trying to get them to come to what we traditionally do. Another common myth, hams don't build anymore. We're becoming appliance operators. This may be even more prevalent than the ham radio is dying myth, and it's been around nearly as long. I'd like to read you a quote from a zero-bias editorial in CQ. It seems that many folks think that amateur radio as a scientific service has stagnated, and in support of their beliefs, they bring up the trend toward all commercial stations, commercial antennas, and other accessories. We can't dispute this trend, but we would rather interpret it a bit differently. We feel that the availability of high-quality commercial gear has simply eased the job of the amateur in the development of communication techniques, instead of eliminating it. The point is this. Amateur radio has come quite a ways from the days of the first commercial equipment, and we must realize that each new technique development has been made possible by that same equipment. To condemn it is foolish. It just isn't possible to turn back the clock to the days when a good ham built all his equipment from key to antenna. To encourage this is to negate the progress of 50 years of amateur radio. And many a new development has come from the shack of an appliance operator. End quote. Anybody want to guess when that was written? Let me scroll around the pictures here and see if I see any hands waving. Oh, you're no fun. I have to tell you, it was August 1964, more than 55 years ago. So the appliance operator myth is older than many of us. In truth, the majority of hams have always been appliance operators to whatever extent they could be. If they weren't, then the commercial ham radio industry never would have gotten off the ground back in the 1930s. At the same time, some proportion of hams have always been builders and still are. We've already mentioned microcontroller projects, and the open source ethos that goes along with them makes it possible for ham builders to develop their own applications or build projects based on other hams programming, and they can add to them and share. In addition, the QRP folks are designing and building kits at a record pace. The hams at AMSAT are continuing to build amateur satellites and the radio gear that travels inside them. And by the way, AMSAT's looking for volunteers to help design and build satellites if you're interested. Talk to them. And our digital gurus are developing both hardware and software for high-speed RF computer networking that rivals what the commercial folks are doing. Plus, there's a new generation of builders, both inside and outside ham radio, who prefer the challenge of building their own stuff to just turning on and using something and replacing it when the batteries won't take a charge anymore. Speaking of which, if you notice that Apple has decided to let people change the batteries in their devices, starting with the next couple of generations of iPhones, and do other repairs as well. That's quite revolutionary. But this new generation of builders and makers are the people we need to reach and bring under the ham radio umbrella. So what are the best ways of doing that? The first step is to persuade ourselves first and prove Pogo wrong, that we are not a hobby of old graying people using low-tech, old-fashioned gear. We are a high-tech spacefaring hobby that is blazing trails into the future, just as it has for the last 100 years. We need to reach out to maker groups, to STEM and STEAM teachers, to related groups. ARIS is a wonderful recruitment tool if you can get a contact scheduled, and there's always opportunities for that. Clubs. Clubs, in my view, are the glue that holds ham radio together. I know there are some people, including some people in leadership positions, who feel that clubs are archaic, just like they may feel that ham radio technology is archaic. Well, I disagree on that too. Clubs like this one are blazing the trails and showing the way to how to be a successful club and how to bring together hams of varying interests and share with each other. And I'm sure you guys already do this, but other clubs need to follow this example of all sorts of activities, whether it's in person or online. You've had the structure in place when COVID hit and made it impossible to get together in person to be able to move a lot of your activities into a forum like this one and to continue and expand and reach out and bring in speakers from all over the place, all over the world, really, who otherwise would not be practical for you to have coming to a meeting. Obviously, we also need in our clubs to be sure to welcome newcomers, especially young people, to meetings, events, activities, and get them involved in doing stuff quickly so they feel like they're part of the club and part of the group and part of the ham community. Of course, the club has to be doing stuff to start with, and that's one of the problems that a lot of other clubs have, is that they sit around and talk about things, but they're not really doing that much. And then we have to carry the message to the media that today's ham radio is indeed high-tech, digital, and the world's only spacefaring hobby. That's the end of my printed remarks. I'll be very happy to discuss any aspect of that or anything else further, answer questions, show you some of my kits that I haven't built yet, anything else. So anybody
let's put this out on the floor. So, because okay. Rich, thanks. I mean, this is a great opener. So where do we start? So, I mean, who wants to go first? Who's got some comments?
Let me go.
Go ahead.
I have numerous times said to people when I admit to being in ham radio that much more sophisticated than what they recollect, may have been told, etc. And there's no amount of explanation, direction in terms of, well, we have a pretty good YouTube channel that will help you understand how advanced and complex or simple that ham radio can be. Perhaps you might want to take a look at some of the YouTubes. I get a lot of the head nod. I may write down the YouTube channel itself and hand it to them on a piece of paper, or even include it in an email if that is the way that we're having some discourse. I just don't get the roadblock. There's something in their mind that they're not grasping, or I'm too close to be able to figure out.
Tom, let me step in if I can. Maybe Rich, you can have a different perspective as an editor of something. I guess from my background, I've sort of got a media hat because I worked in media for many years, sort of going back to the promotion aspect of it. And also, sort of involved in public relations, so you're sort of responsible for getting the word out. For me, the challenge, I guess, has been, the hobby is so broad. It becomes very, very difficult for people sometimes to put together the classic 30-second elevator speech as to what the hobby is. When you get somebody to push back and say, do they still do that? Do you guys still do that? For me, the easiest response is yes. And here are 5 reasons why. Ham radio is what it is today, and it's bigger and I would argue more vibrant, than it's ever been right now. And I think the second aspect of it is just, and maybe because I came from a media background, my frustration is that oftentimes the messengers that we have inside the organization at the club level are not necessarily media people. Okay, we're technical people, and we're interested in different things, and it becomes difficult sometimes for us to sort of articulate what the message is that we really want to be able to convey and talk about what Rich has been talking about. And the fact is that it's a high-tech hobby that's really 21st century, and no people, it's difficult to convey, sort of what that message is at times to some people. So I don't know, Rich, am I right or am I wrong? Or
You're 100% right. And Tom, the answer to your question is that the problem goes back to the poster in your background and the title of this talk. We have met the enemy and he is us. We have collectively created this impression of amateur radio as a hobby that is stuck in the 1950s and 60s of tube radios and all sorts of, analog only. We've created this impression. And as far as, including Morse code to some extent, although many of us love it, it's psychologically, it's an amazing experiment that we did by eliminating the license requirement and thus making it much more popular than it ever was. We have collectively created this impression of amateur radio of being a 20th century activity. And it's because of that, it is very difficult to portray ourselves to people today as being very much a 21st century hobby. And that's what we're talking about. How do we do that? Yeah. So you've hit on the nub of the problem. And we all need to collectively come up with better ways to promote ourselves and to create an accurate impression of what 21st century ham radio is all about.
Yeah, Jim, W2JC. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is W2JC. Couple of comments. What I've noticed that when you talk to non-ham people and you mention you're a ham, the first thing they say, like you just said, oh, do they still do that? So FLARC has a banner that we post anytime we're doing something publicly, and it says, ham radio. Yes, we still do that. And that's a conversation starter. As far as the code goes, one of the features that we always have had in the last quite a few years, Larry, W-A-2-A-L-Y, is an old ship captain. He's a CW devotee. So we set up a table at the public functions, like our street fair presentation and stuff. And Larry calls all the kids over there and he teaches them a new secret message. And the kids love it. They eat it up like crazy. Over?
Yep. Kids love Morse code. It's been my 100% experience. Anytime I've been anywhere with kids and have Morse code available, they eat it up. They love it. It's a secret code. I remember going to an event with WB2UDC, Bob Hopkins, and several other people. It was kind of a career fair at the IEEE. And Bob was did a Morse code booth. It was Stump Professor Bob. We had sheets with code on it. He was, the kids would send a message to him, and he would obviously read it and repeat it back to them, and they were amazed. There was a line of kids waiting to have their turn to do this when it was time for everybody to get back together and start the closing activity for the day. The kids in that line absolutely refused to go back and join the whole group until they had their opportunity to send Morse code to Bob. That's another myth that I forgot about. The kids have no interest in Morse code. Kids love Morse code.
I have a comment.
Sure, Steve, WI2W.
Hi, Rich. Thanks for joining us tonight. Really enjoyed your presentation. So I tell people that I've been a ham for 48 years. And there's only two things in my life that have kept my interest for more than 6 months. One is my wife, and two is my ham radio. And they say, well, what do you like about ham radio? I said,
I'm glad you have her as number one.
Here. She's not here, but even if she was at the moment, she'd agree. Anyway, I say, to this day, I still am fascinated by being able to talk to people around the world using my radio on a wire I threw up in the trees outside. I said, I love talking to people and making contacts. I say, I like the technical aspect because I'm a technical person and the technology is continually changing, and I'm playing with state-of-the-art stuff in my Radio Shack right now. And the third thing is the friendships that I've made. I have ham radio friends that I've known for over 40 years now, and I treasure those friendships, and they've been a constant in my life. So ham radio is a lot of things to me, and I'll do it till the day I die.
You bring up an excellent point there, and it's something that I've frequently said to people, that ham radio is really a people hobby. It's a way of bringing people together, and we use technology to make new friends, talk with our existing friends. It is a technology hobby, but the technology is there to connect us with other people. And at its base, it's a people hobby. It's very difficult to have a QSO without a second person there.
NP4H with a comment?
Sure. No more, go ahead.
This has been a great presentation. Rich, thank you very much for offering it and putting into perspective what our hobby is all about. I've been licensed since 1978. And, you brought a lot of light in terms of how the spiel should be presented to those that are not very much versed on what our hobby is all about. One of the things that I always mention when people ask me about amateur radio, and this is going in the same line as Steve WI2W was going on, and it's, I've been an amateur radio operator all this time, and I'm still learning. There's still things I have not done in all these years as an amateur radio operator that I'm still learning. So this is an evolving hobby. It's a hobby, yes. I personally love the boat anchors, and I enjoy them, and I still remember Heathkit, and I still remember the old Yaesu's FT301s and the 101s and all of that stuff. Even though I have some of those radios, I've also evolved to SDR radios and to all the new technology. And you got to let people know that there's a little bit of that for everybody. I come also from and I use that even in my professional background. It's very similar. I dedicated all my life to radio broadcasting. And I was at a radio station in the early 80s when we were using cart machines and we were using consoles that were all analog and all of that. And now we've evolved to a studio, which you could fit inside a closet and do everything that you used to do before. So that has evolved as well. Everything is evolving. Our hobby is evolving. And I totally agree with Rich in the sense that, you know what? We were pace setters back 60 years ago. And I don't see how our hobby will disappear, stay stagnant, or at the same time go back to old technology. I think we've evolved with the times. We've demonstrated it. You guys mentioned statistics in terms of licensing, so I think we're in good shape. It's just a matter of how we present it to other people and make them understand that this is something worthwhile.
Yeah, Rich, there's a question from Norm, KB2JRP. Yeah. Is there a school amateur radio group that you admire or can hold up as exemplar?
I would say I'm not familiar enough with the school clubs as I should be, but one that is very, very active right now on the college level is the Case Western Reserve University Radio Club. They're very heavily involved in HAMSI, which is an incredible program. And that's one that I can think of off the top of my head. As far as high schools and middle schools, excuse me, I'm not familiar enough with any of those right now. I know there are teachers out there who are doing great things with high school and middle school radio clubs, but I can't identify one or two right off the top of my head.
Yeah, and obviously it takes inspired teachers, to motivate their kids. We had, a speaker earlier this year in terms of, doing balloon tracking, launching a balloon and sort of following it as a STEM experiment. And it was just a marvelous example of how you get kids involved. I mean, we still track the balloons. It's just one of those things. But I think your point about college is really an interesting point because, as you mentioned earlier, the messaging today, young people use media and gather information far differently than cohorts such as mine. Okay, I'm in my early 70s. And I think that translates, in terms of sort of how they use media, where you're not necessarily looking at the traditional media. You look at social media groups for amateur radio, and they're very, very active. And they're very, very vibrant, as they also are for monitoring and shortwave listening. A lot of people say, well, World Radio TV Handbook is gone, and all those things that we sort of had when we were younger. But there's a lot of supplemental media that people are tuning to and being contributors, being their own media, that type of thing.
W2AB with a comment?
Yes, go ahead, Fred.
Okay, I agree with everything that was said. We need to reach out more. We also need to, for the new ham, especially in the younger people and even some of the older ones, uncomplicate it somewhat, because one of the things that's daunting in talking to one of the new hams at one of the clubs up in my area here was that there is so much complication that perhaps maybe in our magazines we could have a little bit more teaching, a little less. How many contacts did you make? Although I'm a contester myself, but the fellow I was talking to said, I would like to learn more about it. And I explained, well, you get your license and that's when you learn. So I think that possibly maybe even like QST, instead of having two letters that are like a half a page long, they could tailor it more towards having more comments. It would be something for the newer ham to have it uncomplicated, where they're not just mired in formulas and this and that. Because a lot of people now are raising families, and we want to keep these young people active, and they need to get into something where they can kind of get in and out. That's one thing. Also, there used to be ham speaking QST. They should bring that back, and I think I've talked to them about that at some point, but we need to keep it simple. Plus, also, like you made the point that it's a people hobby. The most important thing, and like I agree with Steve when he was talking, you can talk to somebody all over the world, and it's just like old friends just keep coming back. It's just amazing. So that's the part of ham radio that is, through the pandemic, had friends all over the place that other people didn't have. So that's my comment. And thank you very much for the talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I can't speak for QST. I can only speak for CQ. We have a monthly column called The Learning Curve, which does exactly what you're looking for. It goes into some basic concepts. And, we've been looking at the basics of components, resistors one month, capacitors another month. This most recent one coming up in January is coax adapters. So we're really covering those basic things that new hams need to know about, want to know about. So yes, it's there. Another thing that we try to do, and this was something from a lesson I took from Ham Radio magazine back in the 70s, because they were the best technical magazine ever published in this hobby. Every article in Ham Radio had a ramp up in the beginning of it. It explained the basics of what this project did and why you might be interested in it, even if it was something that was going to be far beyond your technical abilities at the time. You could read those first couple of paragraphs and understand what it was about and why one might be interested in it if they had the technical skills to do it. I make an effort to make sure that all of the project articles in CQ have a similar ramp up to them so that people can take a look at them and at least understand what it's about and hopefully say, yeah, maybe someday I'd like to do this.
Yeah, Rich, I want to take the CW example and elevate it a little bit, because I found that even with a piece of paper and doing secret codes with my Cub Scouts and the younger Boy Scouts, that was on paper. That was a useful thing to do. Then once you introduced a Morse code key and a sounder, and you had patrols or smaller groups of guys, at different tables at a troop meeting, they would exchange their messages. And it's something boys themselves could run. But now let's take it one step further. What we did was we actually had a bunch of us who were hams in our Boy Scout troop. And we actually had some of us not using FRS radios, but using ham radios on our hikes. And when you're strung out on a 10 or 20 mile hike, the boys could be across a mile and a half. And FRS radios weren't cutting it. Well, more boys and parents wanted to be part of that. How do you get that radio? How come your radio works and my radio doesn't? Well, you have to take a license exam. Oh, well, I'll do a crash course. And so I did a crash course for a bunch of years, and on and on. The other thing is, when I moved here, I put a 5 gig Arden mesh node, commercial off the shelf Ubiquity radios. In other words, I didn't build it, guys. And I flashed it with Arden mesh code. And that's how I connect the ham shack. And that's how we're actually talking now, between the ham shack and the house where the internet is on the property. Well, several of my neighbors saw that, and my new neighbor across the street saw it. And he says, "Hi, my name is James. I'm KO4LPB, and I'm a ham too. What is that?" Because he didn't know. He saw his ham radio was a Baofeng radio. And so you can grow. So between him and Joe Kelman, KI4TR down the street, we're going to actually start building a ham mesh in this neighborhood, which will serve several purposes, including storm alerting for our neighborhood, because we live on the boundary between two National Weather Service offices. So Tallahassee will say there's a tornado coming, and Jacksonville won't even see it because they're too far away. So we're having to pay attention on a different level to our stuff, and we're going to use ham radio for that. So there's other ways to get people involved in the hobby by problem solving, by showing them technology, and getting them interested. And I'll just close with one last thing.
Of course, emergency communications, which is a very significant draw into the hobby. A lot of people become hams because of our capabilities in emergency communications. And that is another area. Again, as Gordon just suggested, not just talking about it, but showing how it works and how it can be of benefit. And that's so much of everything is more show than tell, is very effective. And Nomar, I wanted to just comment on your comment about evolution and ham radio evolving over the years. To just add in one little note there, you're absolutely correct. And it seems that everything that was supposed to kill us, we have adapted and adopted and compromised into. We haven't compromised that. We've compromised the thing that was supposed to kill us to help us. The latest example, of course, is the internet that was going to kill ham radio. Well, hams and ham clubs have made incredible use of the internet, from a meeting like this to using the internet to control your radios. I mean, look at these remotely controlled, multi-distributed stations that are operating in sync with each other from half a dozen different locations in different cities around a country, all with internet connection. So we have subsumed the internet into ham radio, and it has made us stronger. It did not kill us. CB was another example. It was going to kill ham radio. No, it didn't kill ham radio. It's the greatest recruitment tool we've ever had, because ham radio can provide so much more than CB can, but CB whets the appetite.
And still is, by the way, Rich.
Yes.
Other comments, questions?
And to
Ed, it's
Dave,
Van.
go ahead. Dave and then Van, okay? Dave and then Van.
Okay, well, as a media guy as well, I could say I've been a ham for 42 years. Well, since 1978, you do the math. And I'm excited about amateur radio today as I was 40 some odd years ago when I joined the hobby. And but to say also, what people don't realize is ham radio has benefited my career professionally. I'm not going to tell a big story here because a lot of folks know it, but if it wasn't for ham radio, I wouldn't have gotten a lot of major work opportunities in my field, which happens to be radio broadcasting. In fact, I met my business partner through ham radio in a way, and we eventually bought and owned and operated our own commercial broadcast station for almost 14 years. So there are aspects that people don't realize that amateur radio can help people in their careers and help them in ways that they not necessarily realized when they got the license. So it can help you in your real life, if you want to phrase that, versus your radio life.
That's an excellent point, Dave. And probably, I don't know how many of us who are here have benefited professionally from ham radio. I certainly have, beyond the fact that I edit a ham radio magazine. But in my journalism career, ham radio has played a major role in all sorts of things, and including the people, back to being a people hobby. The people you meet, the people you know, there are hams in all aspects of everything. And, when I went I will always remember this, when I went for a job interview at CBS, the executive producer who was interviewing me was also a ham. And he had called me. We were already on a first name basis. I've never, it's the first time I went on a job interview where I was already on a first name basis with the person who was interviewing me. It was just a totally different way of being in an interview. He told me all the reasons why I shouldn't take the job, and when he didn't talk me out of it, he hired me. But throughout my ham radio career and my journalism career, I've always encountered, and my kids are getting tired of this already. They'll mention some place or some activity, and, oh, yeah, I know a ham who's there, who does this, who does that. Perhaps the best example of that was my daughter and a friend of hers several years ago went to Puerto Rico to visit just, for a week or so. And they mentioned the Arecibo Observatory, that they were going to be somewhere near there. I said, oh, well, I have a ham friend there who's basically runs the place. You should get in touch with him. And, I got in touch with him and let him know they were coming and met them and gave them a personal tour before the place fell apart, of course. And, ham radio can just make you the most wonderful connections with the most wonderful people in all walks of life. And that is one of our hidden secrets. But we don't want to tell too many people about that.
Well, Van, you had a point, W2DLT.
Okay. Thank you, Rich. I appreciated the talk. I certainly talk up CQ Magazine as much as I can because I like all the departments, propagation and DXing and contesting and Irwin Maths columns and whatever that some of the competition doesn't have. But my wife, Lori, is here, and she has a comment for you.
Yes. Hi, Rich. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. And we live in a community where not everybody is old, but a lot of the people are older. And many times when we're out to dinner with new people, whatever, and Van mentions that he's a ham operator and a little bit about, what we did when we were younger. I can't tell you how many women and men also thank him profusely for keeping in touch when they were in the service, when they were overseas. When we were in the Mars network, we used to call people and give them information from their loved ones overseas. And they are just delighted to talk to us and thank us so much for the time that we spent.
Good. And Lori's right. We handled thousands of Mars messages, as did Jim W2JC and others. The other thing I wanted to mention is the elephant in the room. What's going on with CQ? Can you give us a little bit of an update? I know you're months behind on publishing, and I look forward to it every month when it shows up. So that's another comment. Lori, you had something else?
One other thing I wanted to say, the emergency communications. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of horrible things happen in the country lately with floods and tornadoes and whatever. And they talk about there's no communications. Well, I know ham radio is there, and I know there are only people that are doing it. The new people need to know what the ham radio operators are doing. And if they mentioned it in their broadcast, I think it would go a lot further to let people know more about ham radio.
Rich, over to you.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with you on that. And that's something that that Ed and I both have been involved in trying to get the league to do a better job of in promoting the coverage of ham radio activities during disasters from our respective positions on the Public Relations Committee at various times. It can be a challenge, but particularly because when you're in the midst of responding to a disaster or emergency, you're busy doing that work, and you don't necessarily have someone available to go talk to the media and try to talk it up and get them to cover what you're doing. So it can be a challenge. And speaking of challenges, to answer the question about the elephant in the room, it's been a very challenging time for us. As any of you out there who are involved with small businesses, I'm sure are aware, this is a challenging time to be running a small business between supply chain issues and shutdowns and quarantines and things like that. It's been a very tough several months here, basically going on over a year since the beginning of the pandemic. We're doing our best to slog through. I think we're getting there. As far as the late printing of print issue goes, it is our plan, once we can get things rolling again, which we're hoping will be very, very soon, to catch up on those issues. We know that a lot of our readers like to collect and archive the issues. And when we've been forced in the past to have a digital-only issue, a lot of people are very unhappy with that because they are missing, they have holes in their collection of print issues. So it is our plan to catch up on those issues, the September through December issues, to do that as quickly as possible, and to hopefully, get back and then stay on schedule. The digital editions have been on schedule, thankfully, throughout. And for any of our print subscribers who would like to get a copy of the digital edition for these months until we can get the print one out to you, just drop me an email or send one to our circulation office at cq@cqm-amateur-radio.com, and we'll send you PDF copies of those issues. We're really apologize to everyone for the situation that we're in, but it's one of those things that is beyond our control, and we're doing our best to work our way through it and to get back on track, hopefully very, very soon.
This is Charlie, AC2ZU. I'd like to mention, too, that this is the 20th year after 9/11, and ham radios played a very critical role during 9/11. Maybe that should be somehow captured and put into CQ or some other magazine to identify what we did.
Oh, let me send you a copy of our October issue, which did just that. I'll send you a PDF. Ed, if you can get me Charlie's email address.
Yep, we'll pass it over to you, Rich.
Okay.
Good. Yeah, it's good that we publicized it's his 20th anniversary. I didn't realize it was in there.
Yep. Yeah, and obviously, but it raises just an interesting point. I think we sort of touched on before, is that there's a lot of messages. And obviously, sort of sitting from a PR perspective, and Rich and I both have been involved with the PR committees. Okay, for the league, and other organizations, is that there's a lot of messages. Okay, that we need to put out. And oftentimes, either because we're not necessarily as experienced in working with media, in terms of looking at the field and how you get those messages out. Sometimes the receptivity of media regarding how they do it and how they want to look at it, pose some issues for us. And also the fact is that publicity is far more than just field day. Okay, is that just when we just listen today to all the personal stories about amateur radio, how we translate that. In terms of how we talk to our friends, how we talk to others that we meet, and how we talk to media about some of those stories. It really makes it, like anything else, you remember a good story. Okay. And it's those types of things that just go beyond the field day event. Okay. That sort of help make ham radio, I think, a little bit more relevant for people's lives right now. So, just personal anecdotes. Other questions or comments before we close?
One other thing on ham radio,
sure.
Publicity for ham radio in emergencies and disasters. We have to keep in mind that the perspective of the media, we generally are not the story. The story is the event and the people who are suffering in the event and the people who are directly involved in helping them out, in rescuing and things like that. That's the story. We are an ancillary part of that story. Just like the Salvation Army with their canteens, the Red Cross with what they do, all of the other organizations that help out in disasters. We're all kind of behind the scenes, helping to make things happen, but we are not frontline responders. And the news media generally has a very limited amount of either time or space in which to present the story. We generally are not the story. When they have an opportunity to do a sidebar, to do a human interest story, we need to be there and to be on their radar so that we can be part of that. But that's a reality of the news business, is that we are ancillary to a story like this. And only when they have the time or space to do a human interest story is there even any chance of that happening. Sometimes we are the story. If we are the only means of communication out of a stricken area, then we are the story and it does get reported. But generally speaking, we're not the story.
Well put. So, other questions or comments before we close?
Hi, David, KD2
MOB. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Richard, nice to meet you. And on this, also nice to meet somebody who worked with Christopher Glenn in the news. He was like probably my first national news person that I've ever known. Not Walter Cronkite, not David Brinkley, but Christopher Glenn. But anyway, I just became a ham about 5 years ago, so I'm relatively new. And I probably missed a good 20 or 30 years in which I probably could have become a ham earlier. But it's amazing, all the people that you meet that are out there. And it's a hobby in which you get to learn from everybody that's around you. Where it's like a fraternity that's out there. You learn from other people, they learn from you. And, like I never knew about things such as Skywarn, where you can be a spotter and people know that, hey, there's, 4 inches of snow on the ground, report it. And that goes up to the National Weather Service. And they get reports from hams from all over the world. It's quite amazing. And you get to see all the communications, all the different types of communications, the digital communications, DMR. It's vast. And I wish the public schools or parochial schools, what have you, when kids are in like 3rd grade, 4th grade, science is a large subject. It's a major subject. And I wish there was a way that, amateur radio could be taught in the schools at that age, just a small portion, but it's a great hobby to be a part of. And, and I'll check out, thank you very much. I will be checking out CQ Magazine.
Okay, thank you. And Chris was a wonderful person to work with and left us far too soon. To your point about ham radio and education, that was one of the schools in pieces I did with Charles Kuralt was about ham radio. Worked it in there. Ham radio is a wonderful educational tool because it covers so many curricular areas. It's not only science and math, but geography, and you can do, foreign languages and stuff like that. The opportunity is tremendous. Unfortunately, in the public school landscape today, there is so much focus on test scores and on teaching what is necessary to do well on those tests, that it's very difficult for teachers to break outside and do creative stuff. And it's I see it not only with ham radio, but in my other environmental hat as well. As Ed was mentioning, my wife and I have run the pollinator garden at our county park, which is right down the street from an elementary school. And we have offered many times to host classes coming over to the garden and seeing butterflies and bees and what they're doing and watching them, with pollination and discovering different things up close and personal, in person. It's not just science isn't just something in a book. We get the same lack of response to that as we do to ham radio because they are just so enmeshed in having to teach what's going to be on the standardized test that it's very difficult to break in with other stuff, even though it may be tremendously useful in a wide variety of ways. So it's a difficult environment to get into. Anybody with suggestions on successful ways of doing that, more than welcome. I'd love to hear them from
youth
both
groups,
perspectives.
Rich, youth groups
Yes.
are the only way. I realized this nonsense 30 years ago, and I just got fed up. I mean, and the backstory of my being fed up, so I won't go in there. But the fact is that give kids an education, you have to do it outside of school.
But unfortunately, youth groups are having their own problems. And so that's another challenge is maintaining the interest level in youth groups, membership and activities in them. But getting in, and even so, getting in with outside activities can still be very difficult. I know when I first moved here 35 years ago, I tried to do ham radio programs in some of the local scout troops because I was an outsider, not known to the leadership for the last 15 years. Very, very difficult to get in the door.
Yeah, Van, go ahead.
Ed, maybe you can talk just a little bit about us going to that 4th grade class with, actually it was with KD2MOB's daughter in the class, but that was good. And we've been asked back a number of times. The other exposure that we get big time is our Great Falls endeavor every spring, but maybe you can address those. Over.
Yeah, I mean, we try to do outreach as a club in terms of looking at community groups, and actually we're sort of I think probably even more standardizing because we're looking at creative sort of like a community outreach group so that, the club doesn't necessarily talk to itself, is that it spends more time trying to be more, I guess, more outward facing. Hate to be a marketer, but sort of use that terminology. But we've taken some time to set up stations for elementary school kids. We've tried to do before the pandemic. We had an annual, as Van mentioned, station set up around Earth Day, going back, I guess, back to Parks on the Air and those types of events. And obviously, and somebody mentioned earlier in terms of being at street fairs, that type of thing, which you get a lot of different kids, and people just in general who not only said, I never knew you guys still do that. But the other point, and somebody mentioned it before in terms of how they got back into the hobby, was that I always wanted to do that. So there's a lot of pent up interest, in terms of getting people involved that way. And I guess it's just sort of pounding the pavement, and sort of blocking and tackling in terms of getting out there, not only with our messages, but with our activities and things that we do, to try and spur some interest. And obviously, I mean, you see it in terms of translating it, in terms of people who have wanted to, become part of the club, or just continue. So I think that's been a plus. Thanks for bringing that up, Fran. So other questions or comments? I'm sort of watching.
One of the biggest growth areas in ham radio in recent years has been among people as they retire. Because they suddenly have time available. They've always wanted to do it, but never seemed to have the time or the resources available, and now they do.
Thank you. It's a very subtle plug for our annual member survey, where we actually asked the question in terms of how you got involved in amateur radio and sort of how you found the club. But it's the things that we sort of ticked off. I mean, I was in SWL. I was involved in CB. I wanted to get involved in terms of technology. I always wanted to do that. I now have the time and I now have the money, and also, and someone earlier mentioned, I think earlier on is, when they were 12 or 13. I mean, those are formative years, sort of who you are is what you were when, is one of those things that when you're between 12 and 14, a lot of those interests are formed, and that to some degree, if you're going to go after younger people, those are probably the formative ages that you want to do some outreach in terms of looking at them. But, but obviously, when we look in terms of club acquisition, in terms of member action, a lot of our members are in their 40s, and 50s, which are not necessarily old and not necessarily young, but middle age, I think, is pretty good. I wish I were middle-aged again, that type of thing. So did I see a hand up? I guess I was just sort of looking and watching our time here, but other questions or comments for Rich or the group?
Sam has a question.
So yeah, Sam, go ahead, please. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, guys. My wife, XYL CFO of KC2OSR, is sitting here, and she's asking what I'm doing to recruit women and particularly young ladies. We have a new member of our club who is an absolute ball of fire. Got her tech license, got on the air with an Anytone. Then we got her a IC 7100A, James Kern, KB2 FCV, and I got the antenna up. And I think she's been on the air 2 weeks, and she's worked 6 countries and 20 states. So with a modest dipole and 2-meter 440, I'm reaching out. I'm the, you guys may know me as the program chair of New Providence Amateur Radio Club. And we have reached out to all the schools. To be perfectly honest, Rich, we've had the door slammed in our face. And we've had, we show up with technology, all kinds of stuff that they can use in STEM.
Well, to answer your wife's question, Sam, there's a limited amount to what we can do directly in the magazine. And what we can do and try to do is to tell people stories. So, if you can get your friend there to write up something about her experiences as a new general, and getting on the air and working DX, that helps. We try to put young people on our covers as frequently as possible, young women on our covers and in our calendars, to try to paint a picture of the broad spectrum of the people who are involved in amateur radio. And one of the things with CQ for many, many years is that we have always strived to have people on the cover, not just pictures of equipment, but we've almost always have a person somewhere on that cover, and we try to have the people on the cover be as diverse as possible in terms of age, gender, and nationality, and everything else. So that's what we try to do. But I would, encourage if your friend there has a good story to tell, and it sounds like she does, write it up and certainly consider it.
Okay.
Sharing those stories, can encourage other people.
She is the mother of a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old. And it's been interesting how the girls at first were not paying attention to us, but now that they're sharing the shack as part of the family computer station, they're becoming more interested. I have a hex beam up on a 51-foot tower, and that has become a topic of conversation. And when the hex beam was in the front yard this fall being rebuilt, it sparked a lot of conversation. And one of the things you mentioned, Rich, was, oh, I thought that hobby was dead. And I said, no, it's more vibrant than ever. The other question is, well, how far have you talked? I just got a card this week from E51JD in the South Cook Islands. And when I opened my mail at the post office, people gathered around me. Well, did you get any cards this time? So I will be in touch with you, Rich, about talking to NPARC. And I thank you for Fork. I appreciate you letting me come in, and I'll pass it back to Rich.
Thank you, Sam. So, Rich, over to you.
Okay.
Any other final comments before we close? We're coming up to the hour. So, Rich?
I just thank you for the opportunity to sit down and chat with you all this evening. I think we've exchanged a lot of good ideas. Appreciated hearing all of your ideas and suggestions as well. We just all need to take what we were talking about tonight and move forward with them. I think we have individual responsibility as well as a collective one to promote the hobby to other people. If every ham can bring in one other person to the hobby, then our 780,000 becomes 1.5 million very quickly. I would encourage people to do that. The old think globally, act locally. Don't be part of the solution. Bring one person into ham radio, then another, then another, then we're talking real money. Just like the senator used to say about a billion here, a billion there. So happy holidays to everyone. Happy New Year. It was great to spend time with you this evening.
Rich, thanks you very, very much for a great conversation. So what a great way to end 2021. And
take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well said. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Rich.